Assalamu alaikum. This is Layla Abdullah-Poulos, and welcome to NBA Muslims Art and Society. This is a little bit of an impromptu art and society because of a topic that has arisen in the news for the last couple of weeks, and I wanted to address it, and so my guests agreed to come on and talk about it. And that's the idea of conscientious objection and a price for social resistance. People from various backgrounds and professions decide to raise their voices and condemn oppression and injustice. Motivated by a sense of humanity and justice, many take to social media to express their dislike for the treatment of subjugated people across social intersections and demand justice. However, asserting one's voice against oppression does not come without its perils. Often, even the most privileged can face drastic consequences when speaking against persecution. Some decide to pivot to a less perilous path. Others persevere and endure hardships when they're speaking out against oppressors. African American Muslims built a liberation movement in the United States based on their Islamic faith and racial identity. Keeping in line with the Quranic guidance, O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or your parents and relatives. They became some of the strongest voices in African American, Muslim American, and intersectional resistance. So, in this modern society, what does that mean when we have not just African American Muslims, but also non African American Muslims, non Black Muslims, who in social spheres are speaking out against injustice and facing some consequences? Joining me tonight is Hakeem Mohammed, blogger for Truth to Power. Assalamu alaikum, Hakeem. How are you?
Alaikum salam, sister. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good.
We were supposed to have Dilshad Ali, but unfortunately she could not make it. So it's you and I. And I apologize, my camera is not working. Well, not actually, it's working. It's not working for me. So I'm going to keep it with just my nice face for tonight. But I really wanted to grapple this, especially considering the fact that two stories kind of hit big when it came to Muslim women in particular. And that's the story of a Muslim girl, media Amani Al-Khatahtbeh and L'Oreal's campaign. So it's a Muslim woman that joined the L'Oreal campaign, Amena Khan. Now, Amani turned down the Revlon Changemaker Award because of the company's ambassador, Gal Gadot, who is a strong supporter of Israel. And so Amani turned it down because of that. Amina hit the news because when she became L'Oreal's, she joined L'Oreal's campaign. Of course, what happens whenever you gain any popularity, everyone goes into your social media and tries to grab whatever they can out of it. And so, some very disturbing tweets. Well, what some people consider disturbing tweets about her support for Palestinian people, speaking out against Palestinian aggression and criticizing the oppressive state of Israel hit. And so she ended up apologizing for those tweets and resigning from the L'Oreal campaign. Okay, so now we have these two women that one was ardently strong against and decided, I'm turning your award down. The other one rolled back on her speaking out against the oppression of the Palestinian people and ended up resigning. So it kind of raised some questions for me about this whole idea of what happens and the consequences for conscientious objection. Okay, so let's start with our first question. All right, so under this guise of under looking at the dominant narrative in mainstream, Muslims are really looking to have some representation in that mainstream in the dominant narrative. Okay, and in many ways, the deen is actually marketed. So my first question to you, Hakeem, would be: how is the deen marketed in ways that capitulate to the dominant narrative and jeopardizes the positioning of Muslims branding their religious identities inside and outside of Muslim markets?
Sure. First, I think that you mentioned, to stand firmly for justice. I think that ayat should always be in our mind because it represents the incompatibility of capitalist representative politics and what Islam truly stands for in Islam. It stands for speaking the truth against oppressors. It stands for standing up and speaking truth to power. And Islam stands for justice. And Islam stands for the eradication of oppression. And of course, anytime you speak a word of truth in a world of deceit, anytime you speak a word of truth in a world that is built upon exploitation and oppression of people, then it inherently evokes fear in the oppressor. And so, in the case of the so-called state of Israel, the state of Israel is a state that was born out of European colonialism, the same European colonialist, racist mass murderers such as Arthur Balfour, who legitimized the creation of Israel in the Middle East, were the same racist European colonialists who established settler colonies such as Rhodesia in southern Africa. And so, without a shadow of a doubt, Israel is an Eastern European colonial output that was placed in the Middle East. And as Muslims, we should have no fear in speaking out against this repressive regime, regardless of the consequences. And we don't put monetary interests as Muslims. We don't believe in putting monetary interests. We don't believe in putting financial interests over people's liberation. People's liberation is first and foremost on our minds, because over and over again in the Quran, Muslims are to be those people who stand up against tyrants and who stands up against oppressors. And when the state of Israel is killing over 500, they killed 500 Palestinian children in the summer of 2014. And in fact, I have this book here. If anybody has any doubts in their mind as to whether Israel is an apartheid state, I have this book, The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa, that details how the strategies that Israel utilized against the Palestinians, they actually supplied some of those same military strategies that helped out apartheid South Africa. And there's another book, Who Israel Arms and Wise, that details Israel's military support to the white supremacist regime of Rhodesia. So if the state was founded by a bunch of Eastern European founding fathers, which displaced the indigenous Palestinians, if the state aligned itself with other oppressive regimes such as apartheid South Africa, such as Rhodesia, and if it's continuously killing its indigenous population, it's a European colonial settler colony. And I want to say to my sister Amena, you should stand strong and you should stand firm in your words. We need more strong sisters like yourself who are willing to speak the truth, speak the truth, and most importantly, to not apologize for that truth, but to stand by it regardless of any consequences.
But she did face consequences, and they shut her down pretty much. And so, as we're thinking about the voices that we assert as Muslims, whether or not we're marketing ourselves or marketing our Muslim identity, okay, there's still consequences that we face. But what happens when we're actually what Margaret Aziza notes as capital enterprises that necessitate appeasing the mainstream and jibing with that dominant narrative? Because when we're looking, Muslims are very, very pressed in this in our current situation. There are many Muslims who are very pressed to have not only representation and recognition, but this a type of acceptance by the dominant culture and in a form of humanization. And so what we see is a lot of Muslims kind of coming out just on their Muslimness to kind of placate and get the broader society to not respect them, but at least to accept them and leave them alone. Okay. And so when we're doing that and we're marketing ourselves that way, there's this expectation that we are going to toe the line when it comes to the dominant culture. So when the dominant culture says, Assalamu alaikum, Dilshad.
Wa alaikum salam. Sorry about the mix up there.
No, it's okay. I'm glad to have you on board. We were just talking about the first question.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, Hakeem.
And so I'm going to repeat the first question. How is the deen marketed in ways that capitulate to the dominant narrative and jeopardizes the positioning of Muslim branding their religious identities inside and outside of Muslim markets? We're always looking for this recognition from the larger society. And there's this expectation that we are going to then speak in a way that's pleasing to the larger society. And, socially we see it in the form of, they just had that sickening video on MTV about hijab. And so like this whole idea of kind of contextualizing it so it's palatable for the non-Muslim gays, mainly white dominant non-Muslim gays. So when we're marketing ourselves that way, what kind of damage are we doing to our ability to object conscientiously to other forms of oppression? Dilshad?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think there's after being in this industry for a long time in the media industry, there's a pushback against trying to represent yourself in a way that is true to what you want to be, and pushing back against the injustices that you see out there, but at the same time trying to, I don't know if it's really called playing the game or trying to work the system so that you can get that kind of power to be able to speak in a stronger voice. But in doing that, sometimes we lose out on what our true message is, what we're trying to get out by trying to play along with those, with the game and trying to, please certain communities and do certain things. So I don't know. I found that where I was in my earlier part of my career is not where I am now. It doesn't matter to me much anymore to try to play along with different social constructs, in light of trying to gain some sort of recognition so that you have a larger platform so that you can say what you want to say, because there's a lot you lose out along the way in doing that,
Well, that's interesting, because I just had this back and forth on Facebook with a group of writers, because there was a post about a job with the New York Times. And I said, no, I'm not going to work for the New York Times. And I was asked, why not? And I said, well, I prefer to use my talents and my resources for Muslim-generated, Muslim-centered media, because I think that is the best platform for me to express and assert myself and my Muslim identity, and as well as the narrative and experiences of Muslims. Because when you move over into the mainstream, and this is my personal opinion, people can disagree with it, but when you move over into the mainstream, you move over into a bubble wherein there's already a narrative there about you as a Muslim male, as a Muslim woman, as a Black Muslim, as a Desi Muslim, as an Arab Muslim. There are all these narratives. And so when you move into those spheres, they are not looking to get rid of those narratives. They're looking to utilize you to reinforce those narratives. So you will have to, on some level, conform to those narratives. And so I think that, when you kind of move out and you want like that larger platform, at what price are you getting that larger platform? Because more people are hearing you, but what are they hearing when they do hear you?
So I think you're making a really solid point there, Layla, because that is, one of the difficulties you'll find if you try to join in with a mainstream organization or a mainstream media outlet or something. I think you're absolutely right. I think you're brought in to fulfill something, and you're brought in to play a certain role. And a lot of people make the argument that you come in to fulfill a certain role, but then you use that position to teach them or to grow out of that role or to bring other people in behind you who should be heard from. And I mean, I understand the honorable intentions behind that, and sometimes it does work, but for that to work well is really difficult. And I think we're in a time and a place right now where there's so many ways to build other platforms and to join. with other organizations or other entities that are doing that hard work without tapping into mainstream productions, that you can still get where you want to get through different paths. You know, it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, I recall when I was, you know, graduating from college, and we're talking like 2 decades ago. So I look at Hakeem and I'm like, man, he's got his whole life in front of him, and it's so exciting. And then when I graduated, it was a trajectory of where you would go and what you would try to do, and the ladder that you had to climb. And it doesn't have to be that way anymore now. And so, you know, I think your point is really solid.
Now, I want to get back to you, Hakeem, because do you mind if we share what happened to you at college recently when you said something about the state of Israel?
For now, I think it's wiser if I keep that.
Okay. Okay. All right. So then let's just move over a little bit to like this whole idea of.
Hold on. I just wanted to leave one key detail out, but I mean I can speak generally on what happened.
Okay.
So essentially, I hosted a lecture in which I detailed that Israel was involved in military deals with the apartheid state of South Africa. And this isn't something that, you know, I decided to concoct, you know, out of my own brain. This is something that's like been attested by multiple academics, including Israeli academics, that Israel, even after embargoes had been placed upon apartheid South Africa, Israel continued to militarily arm apartheid South Africa, and Israel, not only apartheid South Africa, but also the racist settler regime of Rhodesia. And this is just historical facts, and I think it's important in terms of contextualizing and answering as to whether Israel is actually an Eastern European settler colony that is a apartheid state. But essentially what ended up happening is several students from my university, several even alumni started this entire campaign to try to brand me as anti-Semitic, and even try to take certain like institutional actions against me. But alhamdulillah, they were unsuccessful in doing that.
Okay, so all right, good. Now, did you hear that, Dilshad?
I did. I just had to move to a different location. It was too loud upstairs.
No problem at all. Listen, I know your plight. I have the same plight. I'm trying to keep them at bay too. So now here's a student. Okay, speaking his perspective in what is supposed to be a free thinking environment. And he's speaking his perspective, and it jeopardizes his ability to stay in that school. People are seeking to have him removed from that school because he spoke out against the state of Israel. And I think that there's a very unique situation here when you're talking specifically about the oppression that people face in Palestine. And that is that, you know, extra caution needs to be taken by everyone all around, because there just really is this vehement and very violent response to any kind of speaking out against the oppression that the Palestinian people are undergoing, and the complicity of the state of Israel in that oppression. Okay, there's automatic conflation with anti-Semitism. There are systems in place to really kind of tear you down and destroy your career. And it's happened to many, many people. And so a lot of people just really don't have the clout to really kind of speak out honestly against it, even if they wanted to. I mean, I have to be kind of cautious right now because I work in academia. So honestly, I don't know what kind of response I'm going to get from this video, but I just really feel like that's really, really unique. I can rail against the American racist system and racial structure. I can rail against gender oppression. I have to tread very, very carefully when the subject of Israel and Palestine come up. So I think that that's a very unique thing. And these two women kind of like were caught in that, and they both dealt with it different ways. I can see why what happened to Amena Khan happened, because even if you're supporting Palestinian people, even if you're just speaking out against the death of Palestinian children, that's going to be seen as a certain way. And as somebody that's not in, doesn't have the clout or the social capital to kind of do that, in a precarious situation. And a lot of people find themselves in those situations. So when you are speaking out and you're faced with possible expulsion, or you're faced with losing your means of earning money, or you're faced with a certain level of silencing, um, how do you decide exactly what it is you want to do with that?
Actually, that's the exact question I have, with a lot of admiration for what Hakeem has been doing and saying, because like you said, Layla, you look at what kind of platforms you have behind you, what kind of power that you can wield, or what you can do for yourself. So you look at someone like Amani, mashallah, building her Muslim Girl platform and what she's doing, instead of having to rely on others, to be able to do your job. She has built her own platform, which I think has given her a lot more support or empowerment to be able to make these decisions, right? And to be able to say, I'm not going to accept that award. I'm not going to do this. This is not right for who I'm representing. This is not right for the company I'm building. And, and so and that in and of itself, I think is, a really strong move. But when, I look at you, Hakeem, mashallah, in law school, I mean, you got a long ways to go, and to take that stand now, it's even more, it is admirable. It is, it's powerful, because there's a lot at stake, but there's also principles at stake, and, yeah, I mean, if you're able to talk more about that, I'd love to hear that, because that's something. I remember being in college and just staying quiet too often, because you don't want to rock the boat. And that's, and then you'll regret it years later. You should have said something about whatever it was happening at that time.
Well, Hakeem, that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons why I chose you as one of the 2018 NBA Muslim bloggers to watch out for, because you take a stand, and it's a very, very strong stand, and it's kind of like in a lot of ways, it's a stand that I would love to take, but at this point in my career, I'm just too chicken to. I'm gonna be I'm gonna be honest.
We have to be honest about that. Me too, sometimes, yeah.
So it's like he's definitely decided that, I'm going to speak this, and I'm going to speak this truth, and we have a rich tradition of that. It's a prophetic tradition of doing that, speaking that truth, and facing the consequences for that truth. And our prophets, alayhi salam, faced some really drastic consequences. And I mean, if you think about the prophet Musa, even though he came from that privilege, he wasn't in the position of privilege anymore. We had to go and stand, and he knew what he was fighting, and he had to go and stand up and face Pharaoh. When you think about the Sahaba and the Meccan period and what it took, like sometimes you had to stay silent, sometimes you couldn't stay silent, and so it's like our Islamic tradition teaches us to speak out. Allah knows what his creation and what we're going to go through when we speak out, but we still are encouraged to speak out. What happens when we kind of like we don't want to speak out? We don't want to jeopardize that. Are we jeopardizing our Muslim identity? Are we jeopardizing the ability to resist oppression and subjugation if we decide, you know what, I'm not going to say anything at all? Hakeem.
I think what's at stake is fundamentally it's the principles of Islam, which commands, speaking out against oppression. I think fundamentally there's an incompatibility, sort of, with this, capitalist notion of representation, and even in terms of, both the brands of, and what is it, Revlon, right?
Yeah, Revlon and L'Oreal.
Yeah. Both of those two, corporations have major ties with Israel. And when you look at, I would just like anybody watching this should just like objectively, research the origins of Israel. Research, the author Balfour. You'll find that the same, European colonists who were responsible for legitimizing the creation of Israel on Palestinian land were the same European colonists creating settler colonies in Africa. And so for me, as a Muslim, as somebody, especially from the entire Black Muslim tradition, is literally predicated upon speaking out against oppression. I think sort of like when you look at sort of Malcolm X, when you just look at the entire ethos of like Black Muslim, it is predicated on that fundamental concept of speaking out against oppression. In terms of there is a lot at stake, especially when you criticize Israel. But I think it's important to like even just look in terms of just think in terms of like the future. Like ultimately, Israel is on the wrong side of history, and those who support Israel are on the wrong side of history. And there will come a day, inshallah, with those who continue to support the state of Israel, those who continue to suppress speech that's critical of Israel, they're going to be looked in the same way as those who defended, the apartheid state of Africa. They're going to be looked in the same way as those who defended French Algeria. They're going to be looked at the same way as those who defended Rhodesia and the multiple other illegitimate European settler colonies that were founded on indigenous people's lands.
Okay, well, you mentioned the history of Black Muslims and speaking out against injustice, and we have like the two most prominent and immediate examples. There are plenty more, but the two that people tend to identify with almost immediately, like you mentioned, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali lost his title,
Yeah.
okay, because he decided to speak out again, not to get drafted. He decided that he was not going to go into the war in Vietnam, and he was vilified. Okay, even though now that like by the time he died, like history sees him as a hero in many ways. He was vilified at the time, and he stood strong against it. That kind of brings me to two questions. And I want to go to you first, Hakeem, and I want to go to you, Dilshad. The first question is, if we don't, is it more damage to speak out and then to roll back against it, or to stay silent, period? So, like in the case of Amena Khan in particular, a lot of people are criticizing the fact that she rolled back on her statement about Palestine and she apologized for them as opposed to standing a little stronger. What people would think of as standing a little stronger. I think there's a lot to ask someone who really just was about putting on makeup and taking pictures. But you know what? There are activists out there that put on makeup, take pictures, and speak out and everything like that. So, like Iman, she used a lot of her platform to speak out against injustice. And there are plenty of models who do it. So please do not send me any text messages or direct messaging saying that I'm belittling that. But is it more? What did she cause more damage by rolling back on that as opposed to keeping silent? So if we're not prepared for the consequences of objecting against oppression, should we then stay silent?
So I'm glad you mentioned Muhammad Ali, because when Muhammad Ali was stripped of his heavyweight title for speaking out against the Vietnam War, he said that whatever the punishment may be for standing up for my religious convictions, even if it means facing a machine gun, I will face the machine gun before denouncing Elijah Muhammad and the religion of Islam. That's a direct quote from Muhammad Ali, and I think it emphasizes the importance of staying true to your convictions and saying true to principles. When I look at I read the apology from Sister Amina, and she apologized specifically. She said, "I'm sorry if my statements hurt other people." And you think about it, 500. She wrote that tweet in 2014 when the Israeli government killed 500 Palestinian children. And these pro-Israel advocacy groups, we can't be concerned with the hurt feelings of the oppressor. That's like a non-starter. Our feelings should be with the people of Palestine. Our sympathy should be with the people of Palestine, and our sympathy should be with all of the Black people who the Israeli government helped to kill in apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia. So I believe that it's best when you make a statement that's in defense of oppressed people. It's best to stand by that statement. If you're not gonna, if you don't want to stand, if you don't want to stand by it, then being silent is preferable to backing down from the statement and issuing an apology to the oppressor.
Okay. Dilshad.
So, I mean, I was thinking about this as well. And, I think anybody in this day and age, anyone who is trying to rise up in whatever industry they're in or whatever platform they're working on, and if they're up for an award or a recognition or to join the board of something or whatever, you have to realize that people are going to comb through your past history, social media, and otherwise. I mean, you have to know that, right? So you better be prepared. You better be prepared, to stand by what you have said in the past, or to know that, well, I felt that way, but I have since learned and grown, and this is how I feel now, or so on and so forth. I mean, a very, very different example is my own years of work in autism advocacy. And I've now been writing, for 6 years now, sharing personal stories and stuff and advocacy work and thoughts about autism community and issues. And I've changed and grown in certain ways, and certain things I believed in the beginning, I've changed from that, but I'm not going to go back and scrub my past. This is how I felt. This is how I've grown. This is how I've changed. And if someone asks me about it, I have an answer prepared for it. You have to know that. And you better be prepared for that, and I don't think there are certain convictions and things that we hold true to that you shouldn't have to back down from, and you shouldn't back down from. You should be prepared. And I mean, I can't speak for Amena. I wasn't in her position. I don't know what other extraneous parameters were around her. It's really hard to judge someone for what happened when it's just, you really don't know 100% what the inside story was. But for what has been presented to us in the public, I wish she hadn't backed down. I wish she hadn't apologized. Why? Because like Hakeem said, she was critical of Israel during that 2014 bombing of Gaza. We were all critical. I can go back to the summer of 2014 and look at all the different types of posts and articles I published on behalf of other people, and things I posted on social media, through the Pathos Muslim channel and stuff like that. And am I going to pull that back now? No, we try to be objective and fair, but we also try to be strong and critical of things that we feel we need to be critical about, right?
Well,
so
I think that I know that one of the things that was mentioned to me, because when it comes to situations like this, there are certain people, like I talk to other people who I respect and admire, and so I had a long conversation with Marguerite Aziz, and she's brilliant, and she always gives different perspectives. And she said, when you're at that level where L'Oreal is taking on their campaign, you have handlers, you have managers, you have people that are giving you advice. You don't know what advice they were giving to her that got her to the point where she wrote the apology that she wrote. But I also am thinking along the lines of how, and this is getting again to like the tradition, the Black Muslim tradition that Hakeem mentioned, that that extends from the African American tradition of speaking out against your oppression and facing the consequences for it, which were horrendous. I mean, when you think about people like just even in the civil rights movement, I mean, a lot of people like to tote Martin Luther King, but look at what Fannie Lou Hamer, if anyone really wants to know about some of the things that African Americans had to go through in order to just be humanized and to have any kind of civil rights, I mean, even to the level that the tawdry level that it is now. I mean, look at her story. I mean, this woman lost her livelihood, was kicked off of her land, and was almost beaten to death because she wanted to vote. So I think that from a perspective of coming from that tradition, the idea of losing a campaign is not that big a deal. And that's the reason why I really wanted you on, because I'm definitely seeing it from a certain perspective. I'm definitely seeing it from a perspective of when you're talking about the time of Malcolm X. Okay. I mean, you jeopardized your life for asserting your humanity as a Black person in this country. And so now when the stakes are not nearly that high, okay, losing a campaign is not the same stakes. I kind of see it as, why in the world do you apologize? All they're going to do is take some money from you and that's it, you know? So I definitely wanted to have like a different perspective, because from my perspective, it just was like, why are you doing that? And also, do you know the jeopardy that you put the people that are going to face the consequences for you drawing back on? Because another thing that, you know, historically, when people kind of like speak out against oppression and then they wheel back on that oppression, oppressors tend to use that to foster their platform and foster their perspective. So it can be very, very dangerous to do that. And that's why I asked the question, should we be silent as opposed to saying something that we're going to wheel back on? Because at the end of the day, they're still going to take it from you. They're still going to take it from you. As soon as they find out that you're not jiving with what they want you to do, okay, Colin Kaepernick is a perfect example. You're just supposed to throw a ball and that's it. And as soon as you decide, I'm not going to throw a ball, they're going to come down on you. They're going to come down on you hard. So, but by you wheeling back, that gives them even more power and control over the narrative. Okay, because by her saying, I'm sorry that my statements hurt someone, she prioritized the hurt feelings of people over the deaths that she's protesting against.
I mean, that's a really strong point you bring up, Layla, because like you said, we're not going to know what kind of advice she received from her handlers. We're not going to know what her inner circle said to her or what conversation she had with the management of that campaign, unless, you know, that information is made public. We're not going to know. But like you said, either way, she was going to lose the campaign.
She lose it. It was
left it and been like, you know, I'm standing by what I said. I'm sorry that we have to part ways, but it is what it is, or in a much more sophisticated manner, of course. But the other option was to, you know, pull out and apologize at the same time. And, you know, I mean, it's a choice. Again, we don't know what was behind all that, but, you know, it's easy for me to sit here, you know, in my home and say I wouldn't have apologized, you know?
Should Muslims just be more savvy? We are, and I'm talking about in a broader context here. We are so pressed for this mainstream recognition. I'm not even talking about the what we're selling out on, okay? And I'm using that word strongly, and I'm standing by it. So when you come back and say she called Muslims sellout, yes, she did. She called Muslims sellout, okay? When we're selling out on that, okay, how naive are we to think that we can ride both sides of that fence? The dominant structure, the dominant culture does not allow you to ride both sides of that fence. Black people know this. Black Muslims know this, okay? And so now when we're looking at it from this broader perspective, I think Amani knew it, okay? Because she was just like, you know what, orally, wait, nope, that's it, bye. And then she was like, you know, I'm not going to accept this and I'm going to take a stand against this. You know, I think that over time that she developed that understanding. But we're so pressed to get this recognition and to plaster Muslim women in particular, because I don't think that a Muslim man would have had the same flack. I'm going to kind of like think that way. But Muslim women in particular, but Muslims in general, how naive are we in thinking that we're going to get a voice in this mainstream platform that's actually going to contribute to our overall humanization, the diminishing of this false narrative of who we are, especially in the United States, and continue to have our ability to speak out against oppression? Are we just really thinking that we have the ability to do that? And should we kind of like step back and say, listen, we can't do that, so we got to make some tough decisions about exactly what it is we're going to do? Either one.
No, I have thoughts on this, but I thought, Hakeem, you wanted to speak first.
Sure. So I think fundamentally it's very naive to believe that you can, play sides of the fence. And I just want to come back to like something that Sister Amena said that was very strong and that she should have stuck by. She said that, the state of Israel was an illegal state. And the question is, one thing with the oppressor is that they never challenge the veracity of what she says, and they try to make her apologize without contesting the truth of what she said. So is Israel an illegal state or not? Was Arthur Balfour, who signed that declaration to create Israel, was he not a European racist colonist? Was the UN, when it partitioned Palestine to create, the Israeli state, was it not, an all-white, only white institution at that time? And so, to play, both sides of the fence, to me, like, it's a sign of is fundamentally like a sign that you aren't true to your convictions. And if you play both sides of the fence too many times, at some point you're going to lose all convictions, and you're going to become complicit in allowing oppression to continue to happen. You're going to be, there's a quote in the Bible. You can't like serve God and you can't serve Satan, at the same time. You can't serve Jesus and serve Caesar at the same time. So, at some time, you have to pick who you're going to choose. Are you going to follow Pharaoh, or are you going to follow Prophet Moses, peace be upon him? And so, that decision has to be made with clarity. And at the end of the day, if you know that your oppressor is committed to oppression, if you know that your oppressor is committed to, subject why in this sort of like capitalistic way seek representation from your oppressor? Your primary aim, your primary audience. And this, I have an entire, qualms with this whole idea. I personally don't believe that, that if L'Oreal and Revlon, which, it's an irrefutable fact that they are involved heavily with business deals within, the state of Israel, then at that fundamental level, I mean, I don't understand at all why, Muslims should be even involved in those institutions, and we should seek alternative means of, obviously, like, I'm not a Muslim sister, but like alternative means of either, makeup or alternative, enterprises, so that we don't, have to compromise our politics and our political stances to be involved in their institutions.
Well, before we get to those, I want to answer that. And that's because we have deluded not just women. I believe American Muslims in general, when you think of it as a culture, have deluded ourselves into thinking that we've attained what we want because white non-Muslims like us or see us or recognize us. And, subjugated cultures have a tendency to do that. That's not something that's exclusive to American Muslims. It's just that that's what we're talking about right now. And so there's this whole idea that if the New York Times or L'Oreal or the Huffington Post or Nike or Wheaties, if they recognize us, then we've received full recognition, which is okay, which would be okay if that wasn't the goal, that wasn't the standard that we're trying to reach. We don't see it as a standard that we're trying to aspire to. It's one thing to say, like, for Nike to approach a Muslim athlete or something like that, and them deciding, you know what, yeah, okay, so then, yeah, you can use my brand, okay? But it's another thing for that Muslim athlete to feel like I need to aspire to Nike. It's one thing for a Muslim writer to decide to write for the New York Times or the Huffington Post. It's another thing for that Muslim writer to think, I need to write for the New York Times or the Huffington Post to consider myself a valid, credible voice in discussions and dialogue. Because that's when you're giving power over. So it's this aspiration to the broader narrative that is so problematic and troublesome, because we think that that's how we attain the greatness that we deserve. Okay. And also, we delude ourselves into thinking that once I have my voice out there at that point, then I will have my voice heard. And the dynamics of the broader culture is to treat you like a prop. That's all you are as a subject, as anybody from a subjugated group. You're treated like a prop, and they want you to do things and say things a certain way. So that's the reason why we're going after the L'Oreals and the Clarions and everything like that, because we don't value who we are as people, as a culture. We don't value the great things that we can do unless they're recognizing it. We don't value our great writers unless our great writers somehow can get into the Atlantic even. So it's like we don't do that. We don't recognize our entrepreneurs unless they're somehow selling to mainstream people. And it's kind of, there's I see more and more Black Muslims doing it, which is tragic, because we have a rich tradition of do for self. Okay, build in your community, build for your community, market to your community. Okay, and I see more and more Black Muslims trying to attain that same aspiration of fallacy and credibility that all other Muslims are. That's the reason why we're going after them, because we don't value what we make here. We don't value the Pathos Muslim. We don't value those platforms. We don't value Muslim Matters. We don't, not at the same level that we value these non-Muslim mainstream media markets. Like somehow our voices are more important because they're listening to it. We need to be like, listen, we're doing our own, we're doing ourselves, we're writing for ourselves, we're controlling our narrative, and we're not ready to do that. I'm sorry to get preachy. Go ahead, Dilshad.
No, I think you make a lot of strong points there, Layla. I think what the point that you said about are we when we write for a platform like Washington Post or Huffington Post or something, what is our goal and objective in doing that? Is that, something that we're doing for ourselves, for whatever reason, but not because we feel that we need that to justify or to exemplify who we are as a writer, so on and so forth. I mean, it's a very important distinction to make there. I know of several people in various types of industries, from media to business to whatever, who, strive to be, with larger mainstream types of entities and outlets, and realizing that and going that route and then going for that, you are playing into what the higher power structure is looking for in hiring you, but believing that by getting up there in that way that you can affect change from the inside. That whole idea of engaging versus disengaging, or do you want that seat at the table versus, controlling your story better by working for outlets or working for yourself or something like that, where you have more control, where it coalesces more with what your convictions are. These are, tough choices to make. I have seen people make differences, by getting, by getting inside, mainstream power structures and affecting different types of changes from the inside. It's a different battle. It's a different battle they're fighting. And there are things that you conform, and there are things that you give up by doing that. And there are things that you compromise on, but there is other audiences you reach, there are other changes you make that from the outside we may not be seeing, but there are changes and there are things that are improving on the inside. I've seen that happen as well. It's a different choice though, and that's a choice that you have to make. And you do give up, and you may be giving up most likely certain aspects of control over what your messaging is, or things that you feel passionate about, but you have to be quiet about to be part of that organization or that media group or that business or whatever, so those are tough choices.
Well,
and and like you said, other more independent outlets, your Muslim Matters and your Pathos and your Islamica or Islamic Monthly or Muslim Vibe or something like that, Muslim Girl, we have a lot more control over what we want to say, what we don't want to say, where we want to be, where we don't want to be. But then, you're struggling to reach audiences that you may want to reach. I mean,
well,
I don't know if there's one right way or the other. I know people who go a lot of different ways, but I think in each decision, there are things that are getting compromised, or there are things that are thus more difficult to achieve, So I don't know.
I think along the lines of that whole idea of the seat at the table.
Yeah.
All right. This is the way I think of the whole idea of the seat at the table. You can get a seat at the table, but you're not cooking a damn thing. And you have no control of what you're eating. And you have no control of how they serve it to you. Then you have no control of what they serve it to you on. So this whole idea of the seat at the table, at a table where you have absolutely no control over anything else except your presence there, okay, is I just see it as I can't think of a word for it without sounding harsh, so I won't use the word that's in my head.
If I'm gonna, and I'm not arguing against what you're saying, Layla. I think what you're saying is, you're laying it out there hard and cold and true for sure. But if what I could say, even devil's advocate is the wrong terminology here. I guess a counterpoint would be, it starts that way where you're, for people, I'm babbling that right now. I'm sorry. But for that argument of, it is important to have a seat at the table, I think the argument being put forth is that you start out in that position where you can't control what's being served to you. You can't control how it's being served to you. You can't control what's being cooked and given to you. The only thing you're controlling is your presence at that table. And the goal and objective is to get from there and to, you tiny incremental steps, you move along until you have some sort of influential power, or you are able to have some sort of influence over what is being served, what is being said, how it's being prepared. But that path is long and slow and tough, and it's not always going to go the way you want it to, and you can't count on it to go the way you want it to, but it is a path. It is a path, and there have been some achievements made on that path, but it like I said, you're compromising. You are. And everything you're compromising,
I think that as a descendant of people that have been on that path for centuries, right, it doesn't work.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, the way that the society is structured, that table, the food on that table, the servingware on that table, the plates on that table are owned by white men. And they're the ones that invite you to that table. And the moment you say something or do something that they're either not, they're displeased with because they don't want to hear it from you, or somehow they don't find it like whimsical or comical or anything like that, or it doesn't feed their delusions of liberation or conservatism, they're going to boot you off that table. Melissa Harris Perry is a perfect example of that. They do it time and time and time again. They'll offer their platform to people of color, to subjugated people. The moment you don't dance to their tune, they take it away from you as soon as they possibly can. So you
can't argue against that. Yeah.
if blacks in the United States are still fighting against stereotypes that have been generated since slavery, we're still fighting against those stereotypes. And we've been in the media, and we've been mass marketed, and we've had our songs all over the world. And we're like one of the most influential social groups on the planet. And we still have to face those same stereotypes. That table that you're sitting at it at a price, and you're thinking you're going to get something that you're not going to get. What do you think, Hakeem? Sorry, I sounded a little overpassionate, but
no, there's nothing to argue against what you're saying.
What do you think?
I want to come back to the whole idea about media outlets, especially. I think it's important to remember that when Malcolm X was assassinated, the New York Times actually published an article that was critical of Malcolm X, said that he was a violent man, said that he was this evil man, and said that it was essentially a violent end to a violent man. And that New York Times article was completely denigrated Malcolm X. And so that right there should tell you something about mainstream news media outlooks. That's why Malcolm X said, if you aren't careful, the media will have you, hating the people who are oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressors. So in terms of the New York Times, the New York Times, if the mainstream media is being, laudatory of you, if the mainstream media, particularly in terms of the New York Times or any other mainstream media outlet, if those outlets are lauding you, then that right there is suspect. Because when you look at history, everybody, even Martin Luther King, and everybody who sort of like challenged the the white power structure in America, that they were enemies. They were considered to be enemies of these mainstream news media outlooks. Now, in terms of the entire notion about the table and having a seat at the at the table, I think it comes into sort of like situates a discussion as to the political stances that Muslims, especially Muslims, should be taking. I think as Muslims, like, it's very important that our politics aligns itself with the people who are undergoing oppression. I do agree with you, Layla, that sort of the entire when the table is when the table is designed by an oppressor, when the oppressor dictates the food on the table, when the entire design of the table is laid out by oppressors, is very, very little that you can do when you're serving a seat at that table. So alternatively, the only other option is for oppressed people to seek to build their own tables and to provide platforms to other other Muslims, so that they can begin to have an equitable seat at that table, and can begin to shake the table and to create real change.
Yeah, that's probably why I appreciate like it's so, not refreshing is the wrong word. It's just really nice to see that one can work and build their own platform and build their own type of entity now, and it's a different world now. To have that as an alternative, thinking back to when I left college and started working in the media industry, and what was available and what you were striving for and what you could do, whereas now you can finish your education, or while you're getting your education, you can start to work for platforms where you have more control, or build those platforms yourself. Something that Amani has done, or like Sapelo Square. That is a beautiful and powerful platform that's growing right there. Just the work we're doing where I am too. I mean, there's a lot more options. Alhamdulillah.
I think that Pathios in particular, when I look at the Pathios Muslim channel, and I know we have like a teeny tiny share.
Yeah.
But when you look at the content, like, I like to look at everyone's content, and when you look at the content across the board, I don't agree with everyone. Okay, everyone don't agree with me. Okay, but I don't see that other places. I don't see the content that's in Sapelo Square. I don't see that in other places. Like it or not, even the content in Muslim Girl, it's not framed in that way in the larger mainstream media platforms because that's not what they're interested in. Okay,
Right.
they'll dip into a Muslim Girl and Amani now and again, but some of the other stuff that they write, some of the stronger stuff that they write, they leave that stuff alone. And even if it's like some of the stronger stuff, it's because it feeds into this whole fight against liberal fight with conservatives for like oh well, you know what, you hate Muslims type of thing. So I think that when we step back and we look and we see what we're producing in mainstream and in these smaller markets, these Muslim-generated, Muslim-centered markets, there is distinction there that would not be there otherwise. And I think that we have like that tradition of like having those smaller platforms and building that table. That table may be smaller, but you control what goes on onto that table.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's the thing that's going to be the foil to the dominant narrative. You're not going to change the dominant narrative. If you look at African Americans in the society, if you look at Asian Americans in the society, if you look at any subjugated group and the stereotypes that they have to fight against, we've been fighting Native Americans, we've been fighting against those stereotypes, those narratives for centuries. Centuries. And it's only through the platforms that we create and we generate that we do two things. We serve a counter narrative, all right? And we also empower our people, our own people. Because if we didn't have a Sapelo Square, if we didn't have a Muslim Matters, if we didn't have a Truth to Power, okay, where would Muslims go to kind of see that perspective and that outside of that main narrative? That's what I'm saying. It's like you said we need both. I don't think we need the other. But okay, let's just say we do. Let's just say we do. Let's just say we do. Now, if we're navigating, whether we're navigating through our own generated platform or whether we're navigating through the mainstream, how does that dictate our voices of resistance?
You're asking, can you repeat
Hakeem,
that?
sorry, Hakeem. I'm asking you, Hakeem.
Yeah, can you repeat that question, please?
I said whether we're building our own platforms and we're speaking from that platform or the mainstream platform, how does that dictate our voices of resistance? Is there
Sure.
a
Yeah, I think there's a clear distinction. I think when you look at Muslim publications on mainstream news media outlets, even the way in which they address Islamophobia is incredibly problematic and is predicated on this entire notion of white appeasement. So even it's like I've seen several, videos done by Muslims. I've read several articles. I can't think of one in particular right now, but their whole agenda is basically to say, Muslims, we're human too. Islam isn't this bad, evil religion, and it's all based upon their acceptance. And when you aren't able to, and that's all the mainstream media outlets, but when you have your own media outlets, you can begin to sort of address these issues in a way more critical way. And I think, in the Black Muslim tradition in particular, this entire notion of challenging Islamophobia by predicating it upon white appeasement, that is pretty much within the true Black radical tradition. That's something that is non-existent. And so when you see people like Bill Maher on his television show making all sorts of derogatory comments about Islam, I think one of the reasons why people like Bill Maher, people like Sam Harris, people like the myriad of these white, idiotic Islamophobes, the reason why they can bully Muslims, the reason why they can, seek to denigrate, Muslims, because there's really just a lack of strong Muslim voices. And, I was just doing an analysis just of how, Muslims, how they appear on CNN and how they appear on, Fox News. And it's always this apologetic narrative by which, you apologize for certain actions that capitulate to, white notions of collective guilt. And as long as that's all they're doing, then, Muslims are going to continue to be bullied. Muslims are going to continue to be denigrated. And most importantly, Muslims are going to continue to be oppressed. So when you are able to utilize like alternative news media outlets, like for example, I wrote an article that sort of just like critically dealt with some of like Bill Maher's commentaries about Islam, and you can see that it literally reeks of double standards. Keith Bill Maher is telling Keith Ellison, liberal values we need. Liberal values. We need equality. I'm such a great white liberal. I believe in equality for minorities. And then you get into the whole notion of, what is liberalism? What did the founders of liberalism think about Black people? How did Black people and Native Americans become minorities in these countries? And you can see that, whether it be Bill Maher, whether it be Sam Harris, that, what they say and speak about Islam really has no truth to it. But there really is just a lack of Muslims who are willing to in uncompromising and very strong terms address oppressors of Muslims.
Well, I have to give one exception to your example. I agree with you in many ways, but Khalid Beydoun, he refuses to go on Fox. By the way, they've been trying to get after him for years. He's like, Fox who? But he's very, very strong when he goes, and he's not very apologetic. And actually, it's interesting because he spends a lot of his resources in writing for platforms like Al Jazeera. And again, we wouldn't hear like his voice and his perspective about not only Islamophobia, but identities and Arab identities and things like that, because the mainstream is not really interested in that. So are we preparing ourselves and our future generations to kind of like see mainstream media for what it is, and perhaps utilize it, Dilshad, for our own means and purposes, but still and simultaneously build these platforms so that we can empower ourselves and empower each other? And can the two meet? Can someone be on both?
So I don't think Hakeem is going to agree with. I don't think Hakeem will agree with me on this one. And I am shaped and influenced by 20 years in this industry. And, and I've worked for a variety of platforms. Nothing like like I freelanced for the Post or Newsweek or Times, just freelance pieces. But I've been more with either Muslim media outlets or multi-faith media outlets. But I do think there's a place for both. But I do think that you need to recognize what you're up against when you do, or if you do pursue a job or a career in mainstream. You do have to recognize, and you should be aware of, what you were brought in for, or what you were possibly hired to do. You're a lot of times you're hired to fill a niche. You're hired to be a certain type of voice. You're hired to cover certain type of stories in a certain type of way. I mean, we're taught in college that journalism should be, it should be objective and non-biased, but we all know the realities of what that is. We know the realities of what that is. Exactly, So if you are cognizant of that and recognizing of that, and you go into your position with that in mind, and use your opportunities on the inside to put forth stories that would not have been heard otherwise, to bring up let's cover this, or what about that, or I want to interview this person. And it's an uphill battle. I mean, I'm in different Muslim media groups and things like that, where we talk about our problems and our stories from behind the scenes, and it is an uphill battle to be heard, to try to you will pitch 20 stories and one will get accepted, and it's an uphill battle. But so you're like moving the boulder incremental inch by inch. but if things go well, you're moving it. I appreciate that there are, I just don't appreciate it. I'm very grateful that there are alternative media platforms. There are Muslim controlled media platforms. There are multi-faith media platforms. There are more independent agencies where we can go, where we can have some more control, where we can present, different stories that are not going to be heard otherwise. That's where I like to be. That's where I have placed myself for a number of years, because I have much more power and control on how I want to, on what stories I want to elevate, on what voices, that are not being heard, that should be amplified. And, on looking and seeing, where are these gems out there that nobody knows about? Let's bring them out. Let's, put their stories out there, So, I
do both.
I see a place for both. I do, but it's about your choices. It's about, and you got to know that. You got to know what things are going to get compromised. You have to.
And can one person do both? Can one person do both?
It depends on in what way. It depends on how and in what way. I mean, I have worked for alternative media outlets for the majority of my career. I have freelanced and done freelance pieces for mainstream media outlets. I don't know if that's doing both though, so.
Can Hakeem, with his voice that he has at Truth to Power, extremely strong voice, okay?
Yeah.
Can he carry that voice over to the Post or CNN, or is it going to be filtered down? So they may like Hakeem
to filter down, but I think the tide is changing a bit. I think the push will still be there, but I think Hakeem and his generation and the strong voices that are coming up there have a lot more firepower to push back. I do believe that.
Should they anticipate that there will be attempts to filter them?
There's always going to be attempts to filter, always.
And
always.
If they have to make the decision between the filter or not the filter,
I don't know. Let Hakeem speak to
that. I think that there's, when you have, I think that one of the things that we're creating in these Muslim-centered platforms, inshallah, are some strong voices.
Yeah.
Okay. One of them. Okay. You have Bashir Ahmad, very strong voice. You have Nakia Jackson that you need to write her thing. Okay. We have these strong voices that we're producing. If they become popular, okay, which I can totally see Hakeem becoming popular. So let's use him as an example. So now the Atlantic wants you, Hakeem. They just hit you up. Okay? But they don't want the truth to power, Hakeem. They want him a little more tame than he is in the truth to power. Is it worth going for the filter for more numbers, or is it more beneficial for the ummah that he stays strong and convicted and in that smaller share?
Oh wow, that is a really good question.
I tend to ask those.
That's a good question.
So I don't believe in compromising any of my political stances or convictions. And there was an incident where I submitted, I won't say the name of the news media outlet, but I made a statement that was just critical of a certain Islamic scholar who made problematic statements with regards to Black people, and like I totally omitted, just erased it, and I didn't like that at all. And so any news media publication, be it the Atlantic, that would sort of water down and compromise the essence of what I'm trying to articulate, I personally wouldn't want to submit to that publication, because I think the situation that Muslims are in right now in these times, it calls for Muslims to be especially strong with regards to challenging oppression, especially in the black community in general. I think it's in the black community in general, in terms of like advancing Islam in the black community, it requires going back to black Muslims being having political taking principled political stances that are in line with the disenfranchised black masses. This is why, if you look at Malcolm X, if you look at Muhammad Ali, despite the fact that they were vilified very harshly by mainstream media outlooks, their inroads they gained in response to them being vilified by the mainstream media outlooks, their respect only grew among disenfranchised black masses who never had any access to articulate any of their voices in the mainstream media outlets to begin with.
And also, when you think about other narratives, Martin Luther King, okay,
Yeah.
They definitely watered him down because he was extremely radical. He said some really radical stuff, but that's not the part that you see that the majority of people see. You have to actually go and research him to really kind of see what the things he said. About integrating people into the burning house. The subjugated don't ask for their civil rights; they demand them. So like things like that, we're constantly filtered with the "I have a dream" mouth, Martin, but we never really get exposed. The larger masses really don't get exposed with the true radical that Martin Luther King was, and they vilified him too when he spoke against Vietnam. He did it. So, Dilshad, going back to you. All right. If I
I'm sorry. I said I think Hakeem was trying to say something.
Okay. I'm sorry. You said something, Hakeem?
Yeah, I wanted to make a point.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King. I think there's a sermon from Dr. Martin Luther King, why Jesus called a man a fool, that I think is like very relevant to this whole situation with Sister Amena Khan. Essentially, Dr. Martin Luther King, he said he had been receiving a lot of death threats, people threatening to white racists, calling him in the middle of the night saying they would kill his children. And he said like he had gotten like privately, like he had gotten like really really weak. It was during the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, and Martin Luther King said like the constant death threats that he was receiving, that they were like really starting to get with him and making him just want to just quit. And he said that he turned to God. He said like he prayed, he turned to God, and he said he heard in a voice saying, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, and he believed that God would be with him, to the very end if he stood true towards truth. And so I think in turn, Martin Luther King was just like a great example to point out as somebody who theologically whose belief in God motivated him to continue to fight for justice. And of course, Martin Luther King has been whitewashed. His anti-capitalist politics completely whitewashed Martin Luther King's the entire ethos that Martin Luther King had against militarism, against U.S. wars. Martin Luther King was like Muhammad Ali, was critical of the Vietnam War, and Martin Luther King praised Muhammad Ali for fighting against the Vietnam War. And he was demonized for that too, but he kept true to his word, which garnered him respect.
And I want to point out something that I thought that came into my head about you, Dilshad, in particular. If you recall, back when, right after the Trump election, and Muslim women were getting attacked left and right, and they were talking about the victimization, the mainstream media were talking about the victimization of Muslim women. And we kind of did a different thing. We had the prayer and pepper spray thing.
I remember.
Okay. The one video, I took a video clip of you talking about, this is me, this is what I'm going to wear, I'm not going to apologize for it, and everything like that. That clip alone has gotten almost 3,000 views.
Okay? Really?
It still gets views. I go back and I look at it, it still gets views. And for me, okay, of course there'll be haters, but the likes that it got, okay, meant a lot, because it meant that one clip, okay, of a Muslim woman giving a counter narrative to this victimization of Muslim women and woe is me and white people, please protect me. I'm sorry, my filters are gone right now. Okay, so that one clip meant so much to almost 3,000 people. So how many Muslim women looked at it differently because of what you said? Because instead of that dominant running narrative that they've been fed through mass media, now they see something different. They have a chance to look at things differently and from a different perspective. Even though it's a little teeny tiny thing, I've never gotten that many views. Like I've never gone viral, but just those little that amount of people that see that, how many people are positively affected because you did that and because you said that, which was so critical at that time. Okay, because I saw a shift, all right, in a lot of the conversations on social media after you did that clip. Because a lot of the conversations on social media there was a lot of hand wringing and woe is me. And as that clip started circulating through social media, the language of Muslim women started to become stronger, okay, and less apologetic. And I think that that's very, very important because you have this dominant narrative that really wants to kind of frame us in a certain way, put us in pretty pictures, or make us victims. And so when we assert our voices in a different way, even if it's to a smaller audience, I think that is very, very critical. And I think that that's one example of how it can start to change, even in a small group of people. There's like this perspective about something when the larger media is driving it a totally different way. What do you think?
I didn't realize that.
I noticed it. I watched it sometimes.
But I didn't realize that. But what I do agree with what you're saying, and then that it really speaks to the fundamentally what I think I have tried and what I see others around me are trying to do, in at this time in our careers and over the years, is that I know where I am now and what I'm doing now, that it's harder to reach as many people. And I'm not just talking about eyeballs and numbers, but I'm talking about, really opening up different conversations and dialogues with groups of people and audiences who are entrenched in a certain way of thinking or entrenched in a certain mindset without having, really reached out to other opinions, other ways people are living their lives, other truths that people are living. And it is harder. But at the same time, like you said, even with smaller audiences, or even, in a different way, you promote different voices, you bring different stories out, you give folks the opportunity to be able to speak to the things that they want to speak to that have not been heard before. And change starts to happen, and people's minds start to open up a little bit, and you get alternative, information out there, not fake news, but like alternative and real truths that are not, we're not known before. And so I think there is a definite place for it, and I think there is a need for it, and I think that there is a use for it, and I think that's how we stay true to ourselves and trying to in whatever work we're trying to do.
I think that Muslims need, and this is for Hakeem, I think that Muslims need to prioritize it, and I think that we're not doing that. I definitely see a attempt to kind of like drive this American Muslim narrative into something that's very it used to be a lot more diverse, and it's shifting and shifting and shifting. It used to be when you said Muslim, you thought of Black people, okay? Then it shifted to when you said Muslims, you thought of Arabs. Then it shifted to when you said Muslims, you thought of Arab and Desis. Black people are out of the equation. I'm seeing a shift to when you say Muslim, and we may have to edit this out. You guys tell me later. When you say Muslim, you're looking at there's an attempt to shift it to when you say Muslim, you think of kind of like this Sufi-esque liberal white Muslims, despite the fact that they're a minuscule part of the population, because that is the most palatable. If you can put something in a white frame, that is the most palatable that you can get it. Okay. And I think that we see in this in media that if we're not vilifying Muslims, that's saved for the Arabs and for the South Asians and for a lesser extent the blacks. They kind of like pushed us totally out. But when you're talking about making Muslims acceptable in the American frame, the lighter you get, the whiter you get, the more palatable you become. And I see a shift in that as well. And they're giving more and more white Muslim women attention to either further vilify the darker Muslims or kind of be like, look, you can have Islam, you can have a Muslim at your cocktail party because look at this right here. Look at this nice white Muslim woman. She doesn't cover. Okay, she's not asking about Israel and Palestine, and she may take a sip of wine or something like that. So I kind of see that shift that's happening in mainstream media. It's a very, very subtle one, but that's how they always start off, as subtle. They're not just going to throw it out there. So I think that if we continue to kind of like chase after that, and again, they're controlling what food is put out there, and we don't prioritize our voices, the media platforms that we're creating, the companies that we're creating, we're going to have to compromise, not only compromise more and more, we're going to see that our voices are going to be silenced even more. Okay, and for this dominant narrative. What do you think, Hakeem?
So I think many Muslims are in a state of colonization. Many Muslims who come to the United States, their countries were colonized by European colonial powers. And in that colonization process, and an inferiority process was placed upon the Muslim mind. And as a result, you have this phenomenon where if a white person, converts to Islam, this is somehow an iman booster for many colonized Muslims. A white person converts to Islam, therefore Islam must be true, instead of, looking for the sound proofs of, the Islamic belief in Tawheed, rather than looking at, the solid proofs for, the Quran, and just the multiple proofs for attesting to the veracity of Islam. If a white person just converts to Islam, has very little Islamic knowledge, and even if the white convert has Islamic knowledge, many Muslims are just so enamored by these individuals, and they place them on pedestals. And I think this becomes especially dangerous when you have these Muslims who are on pedestals, and then they take political positions and they make political proclamations that literally eviscerate the entire reasons for why Islam spread in the black community to begin with. And Islam spread in the black community because it was seen as a vehicle to overcome white supremacy and to fight for liberation. That in and of itself is a major contributor to the spread of Islam in the black community. And so I think uh, when you continue to have Muslims under this colonial process, under this colonial mindset, elevating, these white Muslim converts in this manner, it sort of continues the marginalization of Black Muslims as well as Black Muslim political voices. And so I think Black Muslims, we have a very unique responsibility. We have the responsibility to, continue dawah in our Black community. We have that responsibility, but also for, the Muslims who have come to this country, we have a responsibility to help them overcome this sort of this colonized mentality that many of them exhibit, and we have the responsibility to make sure that Muslims continue to be the ummah that stands against oppression and tyranny. As Muslims, we should stand with Native Americans who are literally languishing on reservations. Muslims should be at the forefront of Black people, for the Black struggle, for Black people are like languishing in these ghettos that white America has confined Black people to. And just globally, Muslims should be standing up against oppression. And we should never, we have to avoid this phenomenon in which we see, a white person becoming, a Muslim as an iman booster for us, as an iman booster for us, and we should turn to the our true tradition, which is to stand up against oppression and tyranny wherever it may be found.
Dilshad, last question. We're going to end with you because I know you have to go. So I really appreciate both of you staying up late for this. What are the major benefits with us shifting our having a paradigm shift where we actually start to value more the platforms that we create and the content that we create and the perspectives that we create and generate consistently? What are the benefits of that to us as an ummah?
I mean, I think it's pretty obvious the benefits to us as an ummah and in supporting what are considered to be non-mainstream media platforms, maybe Muslim-oriented media platforms or other non-mainstream media platforms where Muslims have a say or a part in that we, we don't necessarily worry about the same things or follow the same rules as might be put forth in mainstream media. I think that, the overarching emphasis on good reporting, strong writing, powerful voices, compelling stories, things that are of interest to us, covering stories of things that are happening in our communities, that is going to be and should be some of the most important things in all these different media outlets and entities. But the difference I find in working in some of the outlets where I have worked is that we're willing to explore things that are not being explored by mainstream media outlets, or we are searching for the types of stories and voices and issues that are not deemed to be important enough for a mainstream media outlet, or it's not going to get enough page views, or it's not going to get enough eyeballs, or it's too esoteric or whatever. So we're not going to put forth time and effort to covering that. But we're doing that over here because, our communities are vast and diverse, and we're not a Muslim community. We're Muslim communities. We're so many vast and variety of communities, with a lot of issues and a lot of things that we're all struggling with and things that we need to know about each other, and come together on and argue about with each other and solve all problems together. And so those things are afforded to us in these types of different platforms, platforms that people are building themselves, platforms that we're joining that, may not be as mainstream as the Post or the Times or LA Times or whatever, but still have some sizable influence, sizable reach, sizable ways of putting out stories and issues that are not getting heard, and they really should be getting heard, and I really appreciate that about my job. I really appreciate about being able to find those kind of stories and find those kind of voices, and myself learn as an editor and as a journalist from people who are working for me and with me, about things that I never knew about. I mean, I look at myself, I've been covering Muslim communities in America for the majority of my career, which is like 17 years now, about 16, 17 years I've been on this beat. And I myself have grown so much in what I've learned and how I've changed and the issues that I didn't think a lot about 10 years ago that I realize are, should have a lot more emphasis on them and should be brought forth, and the voices that I didn't consider back then that I know should be considered and should be elevated and, and should be boosted, So I appreciate the opportunities to be able to do that. And I appreciate that there are many other outlets and many other ways that, we can get in on the ground floor, and we can get in and work with them and put forth, in a way that we can help and we can control better ourselves,
Yeah.
What we want to say and how we want to say it, because the control is the hard thing to give up in that whole editorial process. I mean, even where I work, I mean, editing and editorial, it's a process, and that relationship between the writer and the editor, you know, it's a tough thing to work through, and you have to have a lot of trust between each other to be able to work through that process. So I just, you know, I appreciate it, and I continue to work in that type of an industry, and I continue to want to be in that type of an industry, you know?
I think I completely agree. And I also think that one of the things that Muslim generated platforms offer that you will not get in mainstream media platforms because there's just no space for it. There's no room for it. And that is an Islamic context. Okay. We have, there are many Muslims who see their identity as a cultural identity. And there are many Muslims who see their identity as a faith-based deen, a way of life that they're living. And the far and large, the mainstream media is only really interested in that cultural identity. But we need to live this deen. And so we need platforms where it's given from the perspective and the context of Islam. So you're going to see more Quran. You're going to see more reminders about why we're doing any of this in the first place, which is for the pleasure of Allah. You're going to have less explaining of who you are as a person and more encouragement of developing yourself as a servant of Allah. So I think that that's another reason why these platforms are so important and should be prioritized over all other platforms, because at the end of the day, if you're looking to please your Lord and Creator, if you believe that you're going to face Him, okay, you need to be involved in things and prioritize ways in which you can please Him. And far and large, not all of them, but far and large, Muslim media platforms at the end of the day will at least remind you that what your purpose in being Muslim is and what you're striving for, what we're all ultimately striving for. So I think that's the reason why they should be prioritized over all other media platforms, and that's the reason why I've decided to commit my resources to specifically that. So thank you very much, Jazakallah, to both of you. This was fabulous. I can't wait to cut this up and start putting this out because this was absolutely wonderful. You guys did a great job. I'm sorry to keep you up late. I had a feeling. I was like, there's so much I got to ask them. I want to hear from them. We're going to be up late, but Dilshad cut it short.
Sorry, man.
Feels like I got to go.
I'm holding them at bay back there.
All right. Jazakallah khairan. Get back to your reading. Get back to your kids. And I got to go make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Okay. Thank you, Layla. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum.